everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153. And this is for our class for Tuesday, the 19th of August. And as you can see in the notes below, we are closing in on the ending of the semester. So in the first section, the notes below, what's left is digital gaming, which we will discuss on Thursday. And that's the last chapter that you would be writing a journal on. And then we end the semester by talking about media economics, something that we've really been talking about all semester long. And that is on Tuesday the 26th, leading to our final exam on Thursday the 28th. And what I will be doing is I will be posting our final at the time in which our class would normally meet, which is at 1 p.m. And you have 24 hours in which to submit that final. So the final will be due on the following Friday, the 29th, by 1 p.m. An essay examination where I will give you a series of choices. And it is open book, open notes, so you can utilize your journals and the class discussion forums. The idea is that you can synthesize all of the major elements that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And as you know, I tend to favor questions that are less factual and more opinion-based because I'm more interested in how you're using the facts to support your reasoning. So the idea of the final project is an opportunity for you to examine something in media on your own that is of interest to you. So that final project will be due by the last day of class, which is Thursday, the 28th. So you shouldn't have to worry about your final project as you go into your final exam. That should be your very last assignment. And that was done deliberately. And the final project, we talked a little bit about some of the conventions of writing, and we'll continue to talk about that over the next couple of classes. And I suspect that most of you will be writing academic papers, though certainly you're encouraged to use media in more creative forms. It makes perfect sense to use media to examine media. And last class, we were talking about television. And I can tell you that this was definitely the formative media of my youth. And I was there, so to speak, when the finale of MASH occurred. I remember very clearly watching it. I remember the buzz about it. I was in high school at that point, and that was the major topic of conversation the next day, was the finale of MASH. I was there, so to speak, during the General Hospital Luke and Laura wedding. And this couple was a phenomenon. Everybody knew about Luke and Laura, even if you didn't necessarily watch soap operas. And I can't say necessarily that I have memories of the moon landing, but I think you get the idea of the kind of pivotal role that television played in a media landscape where we really didn't have the kinds of options that we have today. And that leads us to our next chapter, which is music. And I've always struggled about where to put this in the syllabus. As you know, I've tried to go in chronological order, beginning first with the internet, just because it's become the umbrella with convergence for all media. And then we started talking about books, and we've moved our way through the chronology. Obviously, music has existed since the beginning of time, but the idea of music being accessible to masses of individuals didn't exist since the beginning of time. And I suppose we could have talked about music immediately after the radio section, for instance, because both of those are so closely tied together. But again, being a product of the 1980s, I think of music being very closely tied to television, and that was because of MTV, which stood for and stands for Music Television. And at the time, it was a station that was devoted completely to playing music videos, which was a revolutionary idea. It wasn't necessarily that videos had never been done before, but they had never been done in such a systematic and conscious way. And while I can't say that I was there during the premiere of MTV, I didn't have a cable subscription. I certainly heard about it, and I can tell you that everybody wanted a cable subscription so that we could access MTV and see these music videos, which were basically compressed narratives. And if you look at the notes below under the second section for MTV, I have given you a link where you can watch the 1981 launch of MTV. I suggest you watch up until minute 4 and actually 4 minutes and 30 seconds. That'll give you an idea of the first song that was played on MTV, which was Video Killed the Radio Star, which ended up being rather prophetic, actually. And I remember that in my college days, I actually took a class in MTV narratives. It was one of the more interesting classes that I had ever taken. And we were examining these narratives in the way that we would examine literary texts. But of course, there was more than just examining the music lyrics. It was the visuals and the way the narrative fit together. And if you look at those early days of videos, they seem rather simplistic, but there were a few that really I think made an impact. And that said, I encourage you to continue to watch the MTV launch, but do watch the 4 minute mark, up to the 4 minute mark, so that you've got a sense of the history of it. And talking about history, sound recording history. And you can see that this began in the mid 1800s, where we were talking about this, about the French making sound recording experiments. But it was in the later 1800s, 1877, that an American, Thomas Edison, recorded his own voice. And he patented the phonograph, which used foil cylinders basically to record audio signals. 1887, a German developed flat disc records, which was certainly much more convenient than a foil cylinder, and patented the gramophone. So now this is really the beginning of mass production. In 1906, the Victor talking machine was put into furniture, the Victrola, very similar to what we've talked about as what happened with radio and what happened with television as well. 1930s, the beginning of magnetic audio tapes, where you've got sound editing and you've got the possibility of multi-tracking. 1940, these wax and shellac discs were replaced with vinyl, which was improved longer playtime and also much improved audio. You could have 20 minutes per side. In 1950s, multi-track recording, 2 separate channels and tracks, known as stereo. And in the 1970s, digital recording began with the binary on and off signals that we've talked about, how that revolutionized all of media through the internet. 1980s was really the height of the compact disc, known as CDs, and of course, the launch of MTV. 1990s is where we get the beginning of convergence. This was illegal internet sharing of MP3s. These were compressed digital recordings. Napster, yeah, it's a company you might have heard of. They really led the revolution for these illegal recordings, and the music industry scrambled. And the result of that was in the 2000s, the establishment of iTunes, where you could purchase your downloads. This was at the height of the iPod, for instance. But in 2010s, the whole system was disrupted again with streaming, where you've got subscription and or ad-supported access rather than ownership. You don't need to own the music. You just need to have access to the music, a music library, if you will. And this is where we see the things like growth of independent music labels and internet self-uploads. And as is usually the case when we get to the 2020s in all of our media, AI and the questions of how that's going to revolutionize the industry. Now, the text talks a little bit about some musical genres, and I wanted to focus, and the text also focuses on popular music, because this is, after all, a class in media and popular culture. So popular music being music that appeals to a wide cross-section of individuals. So starting with the early to maybe mid-1900s is where show tunes and vocal ballads were considered the popular music of the day. You might have heard of Frank Sinatra, who's known as a crooner. 1920s to 1940s would be the beginnings of jazz, which was completely revolutionary because it was really a new musical genre from black audience or from black composers and from black singers, primarily geared towards black audiences initially. Think about Louis Armstrong. And it was improvised, so there was a sense of risque associated with this music that you couldn't find with other musical forms. This was integrated in the 1950s for something called rock and roll, which was a blues slang term for sex. And Elvis Presley, Little Richard. And what was interesting, I think, is that Elvis Presley was able to take sounds that were considered to be, quote, black, unquote, and sing them as a white performer. So a lot of the racism and the appropriation of the time is illustrated in the way that music was produced and what was considered to be popular. Little Richard deliberately created an image that wouldn't seem to be threatening to mass audiences. So he tried to be as outlandish as possible so he wouldn't be viewed as a sex symbol. Again, these were the times where segregation was ending. And the 1960s is fondly known as the British invasion, where you've got groups like, and I suspect you've heard these names, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and they too were covering black artists. This was also the time of folk music, of music devoted to social activism. Joan Baez is a name that you might be familiar with. And also psychedelic music. The 1960s was definitely a drug culture time period. You might have heard of Jimi Hendrix. 1969, perhaps one of the most famous rock concerts in history, Woodstock, that occurred in a New York dairy farm that was devoted to 3 days in August of peace and music. 1970s is when we see some of the pushback to some of the commercialization that was happening to not only rock and roll, but some folk music as well. So punk rock was a response to that. Groups like the Ramones, or you might have heard of Blondie, a very famous club in New York City, which is considered to be the central point for the development of punk, is CBGB. And once we get to the 1980s to the present, you've got things like hip hop, which is urban rapping and sampling. Run DMC had the first hip hop gold record in 1984. 1990s, grunge, messy guitar sounds, very anti-fashion. Nirvana is a name that you might be familiar with. A name that maybe you aren't familiar with is Max Martin for the 2000s. He is a pop songwriter for other artists and ended up creating a formula for a successful pop song. In fact, in the notes below, I've got a brief video about 3 minutes long or so, talking a little bit about that formula that he used and others copied behind every perfect pop song that I would ask you to view. So if you're wondering why so much music sounds the same, there are reasons for it. Now, thinking about the 2010s, female pop artists, and it was definitely a male-dominated genre in its early days. Names like Taylor Swift, Adele, Rihanna. And what was interesting, or what is interesting about some of these names, is the way that they were able to seize independent control, which is the video that I wanted you to see about Taylor Swift. This gets us to the section on influential musical artists, which I know is subjective, just like what is the best movie is subjective. And certainly identifying the most influential musical artist is subjective. You can perhaps use record sales, but that is increasingly complicated in the time of streaming because it's not easy to track in the way it would have been in the past. But I have 3 names for you to consider. And they do, in some ways, represent my own bias. But when I think of musical groups and influence, I think of the Beatles. And it's hard to explain the kind of hysteria that was associated with the Beatles. This was a little bit before my time. This was in the 1960s. And I wanted you to watch just a brief video, and you can see this in the notes below, 3 minutes long, about Beatlemania, the kind of hysteria that was associated with this group that likened itself to basically God. And people would faint in concerts and burst into tears. That said, when we talk about male artists, and there's lots of male artists we can think about, but one that I suspect you've heard of, Elvis Presley. And Elvis was so important, not just because he was able to translate rhythms that had been associated with the Black community into a wide mainstream white audience, but he was also known as being very subversive. And in our time, he seems quite tame. But there was a variety show, the Milton Berle Show, that was quite famous because of Elvis's performance of the Hound Dog song that resulted in all kinds of protests. The reason why was because of his gyrating hips. And when he reappeared on the Milton Berle Show, they were ordered to film just from the waist up so that you didn't see the hips because it was so suggestive sexually. So I wanted you to read an article about that so that you can get a sense as to how subversive that particular performance was. From this day in history, Elvis Rocks, the Milton Berle Show. And I also have the performance for you to watch so you can judge for yourself. Keep in mind, it was a completely different time period, 1956. And this is 3 minutes long. And you can hear some of the audience's responses to his performance as well. Taylor Swift, when I think of female artists, it's hard to identify an artist that has taken such control of her career as Taylor Swift. We know about the Eras Tour, and we know about the incredible money that brought in. We know what a savvy business person Taylor Swift is because she was able to put the Eras Tour on film and merchandise it. But when I think about Taylor Swift, I think about the fact that she ultimately initially lost control of the masters of her work, the first 6 albums, and not only re-recorded those albums, so this was Taylor's version, so that she could at least have some ownership, but she was ultimately successful in purchasing back the original masters. Of course, the Eras Tour helped her do that because she earned an incredible amount of money. And I have a brief video for you to watch, also 3 minutes long. It just happens to be a brief segment from Good Morning America, talking a little bit about Taylor Swift buying back her masters for her first 6 albums. So, pop music formulas from a video from D News, the formula behind every perfect pop song. Also 3 minutes, and it talks a little bit about the Max Martins of our time. And today's attendance question is going to be based on what some studies have found in terms of music. And studies have found that the music that one listens to in their adolescence is particularly powerful and impactful. And of course, you can look up some of the reasons why, and feel free to do so, but I'm really more interested in your own personal experiences. Do you agree or disagree with these findings, and why? And I can tell you that I have found the music of my adolescence to be particularly impactful and powerful, and I still listen to it. And I'll share some of the reasons why next class, but I'm curious to see what your perspectives are about that. So you've got several brief videos to watch. The first being about Beatlemania. The second being about Elvis Presley on the Milton Berle Show. The third being about Taylor Swift buying back her masters. The fourth being the formula behind every perfect pop song. and of course, the MTV launch. So I leave you now with watching these video clips and our attendance question about the importance of music in adolescence. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class and talk about video games. Take care. Bye-bye.